So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature. We're looking at the penultimate class today on nervous conditions. So this will be the second last session. We'll have one more session after this, and then we'll wrap up with this novel and then move on to a new text. So we're following this essay that is a very comprehensive coverage of this novel. It talks about the issues in the novel as well as offering a critical insight into those issues as well. So this is page 63 in the essay that we are sharing and we are reading together. And this is, I'm just going to rehearse a little bit about things which we have already covered and then move on to the final bits of the essay, with which I will conclude in the next lecture. So this is the beginning of the winding up session for the novel Nervous Conditions. So this is the final paragraph of page 63 of the essay that we are looking at, and this should be on your screen. So Nervous Conditions points out that where African women's lives are confined in suffocating social or familial spheres or their own rightful and affirmative spaces are assaulted, it would be hard for society at large, and the dominating males particularly, to have restful mind or maintain a spotless home, no matter its size and beauty. So we are seeing how the issue of space is a very important element in the story, and how space can be coercive, space can be confining, space can be liberating, and space is almost always already gendered in quality, right? So there's a gendering of space. This discursive spaces in Nervous Conditions obviously becomes a very important pointer to the way in which this novel can be read. And this essay in particular is about the spatiality in the novel. And obviously, if you look at it from a slightly more metafictional way, the space of the novel, the Nervous Condition novel, the space inside the novel, also becomes quite important in terms of how the characters are played out, how the characters are fleshed out and promoted, foregrounded, marginalized, etc. So this is why Tambu, who refuses to be seduced by it, demystifies Babamukuru's house from palace, mansion, castle, and heaven to simply that, a house, right? So again, look at the way in which the definition of a space, the classification of a space is quite political in quality. If you call a particular house a palace, you're obviously conferring a certain authority to it, certain power to it, certain prestige marker to it. But if you're refusing to do that, if you're rejecting that kind of an authority, you just simply call it a house, which brings it down to a more egalitarian, more democratic, more demystified definition, right? So the whole idea of palace, mansion, castle, heaven, I mean, these are more often than not very patriarchal constructs of fantasy spaces, of control, of power, of prestige, of authority, etc. But the feminist rejection of it gets played out in very simple, subtle terms, in terms of calling this just a house, right? So that is a demystification, which is also some kind of a radical revision of this discourse. He himself, that is Babamukuru, he himself is no more than a man. In fact, a delimiting, distant, and destructive divinity, right? So the conferring of the divine status to the male is obviously part of the patriarchal impulse that this novel has. And that impulse is deconstructed, that ideology is deconstructed. Although this novel is much more than just a deconstruction of patriarchy, it's a very complex novel about complex human conditions, emotional conditions, and so ambivalence and ambiguity play very key roles in this novel, in terms of how there is no black and white, good or evil, right? So everyone is ambivalent in quality, everyone is gray in quality, and this grayness of characters, this grayness of conditions is what makes this novel a novel about nervous conditions, right? Because we spent some time already talking about the title of the novel, Nervous Conditions. It's a medical metaphor, right? But then we see in the novel how this gets manifested and is informed by political conditions, how the medical and the political are connected categories. So we have seen that already if you remember Malibu and the other writers who we have read. I mean, Mrs. Dalloway, for instance, how the convergence or the collusion, shall we say, between medicine and politics has always been there historically through different points of time. And this novel is just another very classic example of that. Right, so a very typical example how the political condition is also the medical condition and vice versa. So this destructiveness is reinforced in his house's damaged and damaging attributes, and in his severance of his household's familial, spiritual, and gender bonds. So Babamukuru, the protagonist in the house, the big man, the big masculine presence in the house, is seen to be almost entirely alienated from the goings on, from the domestic discourses in the house, and in that alienation is also his vulnerability. That alienation is also his damaged quality. So in his capacity as God in heaven, or up there, Babamukuru is not close to the pulse of females in his household down there, right? So down here and up there. So these become pointers to power, but they also become pointers to the gap, the yawning, unbridgeable gap between the male and the female, between the powerful and the powerless. And what this novel shows very quickly is that the powerful in this novel, or the people in positions of power, they are also vulnerable precisely because they are powerful, and they are damaged precisely due to the position of power. So power damages them. Power damages them mentally, emotionally, existentially. So power is seen in this novel as some kind of a damaging condition, and that is a nervous condition in the novel. So being powerful doesn't mean being happy. It's actually quite the reverse. The contrary. So being powerful also makes him more vulnerable. Being powerful also makes him more damaged. Being powerful also makes him more distant from any understanding of reality, from any knowledge and recognition of reality. So Babamukuru in this novel, along with being a despicable figure, he's also a pitiable figure. He's also a pathetic figure, someone we should take pity on. And the novel makes it quite clear as well. He's not painted as a monster entirely, right? So the monstrosity and the masculinity of Babamukuru is also, converged or corresponded to his, this feeling of his situatedness of being a vulnerable, confused man, right? So someone who's been brainwashed into a patriarchal system, but has also been damaged by that same brainwashing, by the same process of internalization. Okay, so he operates, Babamukuru operates from an otherworldly space, different and distant from the earthly realities of female experience. So, I mean, again, look at the way in which the female experience is quite gendered in quality. The spaces are quite gendered in quality, the kitchen space, the dining room space, whereas Babamukuru space is seen as otherworldly, away from all these spaces, right? So profoundly patriarchal and hence otherworldly. While he shares physically the same domestic space with a woman, we are told that he could detect alcohol on your breath at 5 yards and a strong wind. He's not in touch emotionally and spiritually with the inner plight and life, right? So there's a sense of control and coercion that he has. He can, forbid a woman from drinking. He can sniff alcohol from 5 yards. So he has this detective power. Very, very masculinist detective power, but at the same time, he's emotionally quite challenged. He's emotionally quite distant and alienated from the woman of the house. So that emotional disconnect is exactly what makes this entire system so damaged in quality, right? Little wonder then Babamukuru feels out of place in a feminine space, the dressmaker's shop in Sakuba township. Again, a very small space when the multitasking woman dressmaker, as does my guru with the mission house kitchen, manages to keep the clothes clean, the patterns together, even with the shop's spatial and other constraints. Now, this is the sign of a really great novel, that it just brings under seemingly unimportant spaces and figures. But despite being seemingly unimportant, seemingly insignificant, they actually end up being very, very functional and very, very symbolic in the context of the novel. Now, this dressmaker's shop in Sakuba township is a very symbolic space, because this is away from the patriarchal control. This is run entirely by a woman, and we can see the image of the multitasking woman, someone who can run a shop, maintain a household, maintain an establishment, keep count of money, be very, very professional, efficient. And this multitasking woman becomes a complete contrast to this otherworldly, patriarchal, authoritative men who are actually quite inefficient in their own ways, right? Now, so this symbolic spaces which are run by a woman become almost, very, very liberatory in certain sense. They liberate the woman from the confines of the household, from the confines of patriarchy. And unsurprisingly, this is also a space where Babamukuru feels very alienated, very, very, vulnerable, very powerless, because, it is a very female space run by a woman, a multitasking, efficient woman. It's not a big, huge space, but despite the confined sort of space, it is very heavily gendered in a very emancipatory way. And this emancipation that a woman experiences while going there is exactly what makes Babamukuru vulnerable in quality. It just makes him feel powerless and agency-less. And agency, of course, is a very important issue in this novel, right? Agency being the ability or the opportunity to carry out your will, or the ability to have that opportunity to carry out your will, right? So, which is almost always, entirely absent in these women. But this particular dressmaker's shop in the township of Sakuva, becomes a very symbolic space for female agency. So I just want to spend a little bit of time there, and I want to pay some attention to this as well. And how does a small space, a very small space, play such a key symbolic role in a novel like this? So little wonder that he, the omniscient, fails to know and to see his daughter Nyasha's rapidly worsening health, but instead misjudges it as not so serious. What she needs, he concludes, is to rest. Now, this is, I just want to spend a little bit of time with this, and I may have mentioned this earlier, but, I just want to revisit that discourse of confined-care, right? So the ability or the authority or the law whereby the sick subject should be confined in the house and, and then be cured in the process of resting. Now, those of you, some of you remember, this is something very similar to what happens in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, where the soldier, the PTSD suffering soldier, at that time called shell shock soldier, was asked to be confined in the house, was asked to, go through this rest cure. In other words, his mobility, his motor movements, his bodily movements will be controlled and confined in a very coercive way. So despite having the word rest to it, it's actually a form of coercion, a form of sort of a coercive treatment, right, whereby the doctor or the figure of authority, almost always the male figure of authority, would confine the sufferer, again, more usually than not, the woman sufferer, into the confines of a house. And that confinement was supposedly, something which will cure the suffering person. But then we can see how this confinement also comes with authority, with an absence of agency, the absence of basic motor agency. You can't walk, you can't talk, you can't leave the room, etc. So this is a form of imprisonment. And we can see how this age-old patriarchal principle of curing the suffering woman by confining the person in a small room gets replicated in this, this novel as well, Nervous Conditions, where Babamukuru pompously pronounces that his own daughter Nyasha, whose health is worsening and suffering very rapidly. Actually, if you read the novel, it's very rapid deterioration, but he misjudges it and to consider it not so serious, and confines her in the house, confines her in a small room in the house. And what she needs, he concludes, is to rest, right? So again, the voice of authority, the voice of this all-knowing male authority is quite, is amply evident, is, abundantly evident over here, right? And that's, again, part of the age-old custom of male control, patriarchal control, and that's something which we see here in this novel as well. So despite being omniscient, so you can see the word omniscient is italicized over here, which is obviously some sort of an ironical parody to it. I mean, he, the omniscient God figure in the house, fails to see or fails to understand even the basic medical condition his own daughter is suffering from, and he just pronounces it to be some kind of a nervous condition which should be which can be cured by making the person rest, right? So the age-old way to treat the quote-unquote hysteric woman by confining the person. Right, so Babamukuru's persistent steeliness as his daughter's health declines deepens his human and ideological flaws. So we can see how the medical condition very quickly connects to and is informed by ideological conditions, by ideological indoctrination, ideological internalization. However, in tandem with the novel's disinterest in narrowness and one-dimensionality, he is depicted not as a total monster, but rather as a pitiable confluence of competing historical inheritances, right? So, and this is a bit in a novel where it really begins to become a complex narrative about human beings rather than being about monsters and angels. So they're not really sufferers and victims in a very clear-cut way. Sufferers, victims, and perpetrators in a clear-cut way. Everyone's suffering in this novel. Everyone's suffering in different degrees in novels. So some people suffer directly in the hands of authoritative figures, and there are certain people who are actually authoritative, but they are also sufferers because they internalize this doctrine, and in their head, in their mental state, in their principles, they just grow up consuming a very confused set of principles, a confused and confusing set of principles. So therein lies the quality of competing historical inheritances. So he has grown up inheriting certain ideologies which are sometimes contradictory, sometimes at conflict with each other. And this conflicting quality of these ideologies is exactly what makes him, I don't know, a confused character. And in his confusion, he just becomes more authoritative, but also in a pitiable way, sad way, in a petty, pathetic way, rather than being this monstrous figure. So there's no attempt on the part of the novel to make him just a monolithic monster. I mean, that would just be a little reductionist. But what is happening here instead is that Babamukuru becomes a grey character. I mean, he's obviously quite vile, he's obviously quite authoritative, he's obviously quite patriarchal in a very vicious way. But what we also see is how this vicious patriarchy that he has is just a process of indoctrination that he grew up consuming as a child, as a boy, as a young man, and then now as a patriarch. And most importantly, what we see in the novel is how this competing cultures of colonialism and local tradition makes it worse for him, right? And this hodgepodge of all kinds of influences makes him a very confused character, which makes them misjudge conditions, which makes them misread people, and which makes them ultimately very, very lonely and very alienated from everything that's going around him. Okay, so he's a pitiable confluence, as we see, of competing historical inheritances. If it is any indication, Nyasha's anguished comment that it's not altogether her father's fault, in that they in England did it especially to him. They put him through it all, turning him into a good boy, a good mont, a bloody good Kafir. Right, so, this English education is exactly what has confused him, and in the process has made him more of a patriarch rather than less. Then it makes sense, the argument that he is as much a victimizer as he's a victim of worrying cultural institutions. So, as we can see, the borderlines between perpetrator and sufferer begins to get a little blurred in this novel, right? So we find that despite being largely the patriarchal perpetrator of all kinds of violence, physical, corporeal, emotional, existential violence, I mean, he too becomes, at the end, a sufferer of the same violence because he's confused, he doesn't know what he's doing, and he thinks a part of him thinks this is a good thing, and the other part of him is completely clueless because, he's just got a very incomplete grasp of reality, despite his position of authority. Right, so this is what the English education has done to him. So he's a product of his time, consistent with how Namo, before his death, was acting in the expected manner. So Babamukuru is a man overwhelmed by the responsibilities his success entails. Sue Thomas says it best. Babamukuru's position is a difficult one. He's placed within and has to negotiate with two systems of economic, political, and family regulation, the English and the Shona. Right, so there's this, local cultural narrative of the Shona tribe that he's grown up with. At the same time, he's been further confused and complicated by the English education. And at the end of it all, we have this, entanglement of different kinds of patriarchy, which has made him the flawed human character that he is, which, more often than not, manifests itself through monstrosity. But then he can be monstrous as a character, but he's not a monster. And therein lies a difference. So his monstrosity is a combination, is a function, or is a construct of his conflicting internalizations, is a construct of his conflicting brainwashing, conflicting consumption of ideologies. Right? That is what makes him monstrous in quality. So that's the subtle but significant difference between being a monster and being monstrous. Being monstrous means there is a human quality to it. You just become monstrous because, you're making a series of bad decisions and making a series of vicious decisions. Of course, this doesn't justify it all. But then what it also does, it opens up the character to a study of grayness, of ambivalence, of perhaps being a victim in his own way, right? And that's something which you see in Babamukuru's character as well. So despite being a patriarchal figure, we can see him as much a sufferer of patriarchy rather than just being a blunt perpetrator of it. So Dangarembga worries nonetheless that false yet despotic male divinities and spaces could emerge at the fortuitous convergence of the complications of one's position as family benefactor and the other elements that transform some of Africa's post-colonial elite into powerhouses and spaces, right? So there's a question of post-colonial elite which comes into being, and that's something which you find in almost all post-colonial condition, that after the end of the colonial control, what takes over, the section which takes over is the post-colonial elite. And that, in a way, becomes a replication of the colonial coercive quality, the colonial culture of control, coercion, and exploitation. So that same structures continue, and we find something similar happening here as well. So, Babamukuru may be seen as a post-colonial elite in a temporal sense as well as in a systematic cultural sense. Right. The elements include, these are the attributes, the markers of elitism in a post-colonial framework. The elements include order of birth, privileged gender, pioneering education, professional hierarchy, marital position, parental rights, and economic benefaction. So these are the markers of elitism. So the position of power, the birth, what kind of family, the order of birth. There's a hierarchical system of family. It comes from a series of different kinds of kinship systems and cultural systems. So the order of birth becomes important. Which family are you born into? Which subsection of society are you born into? That determines the positions of power. That informs positions of power subsequently. And connected to all this is obviously the privilege of gender, whether you're male or female, the access to education, more often than not, colonial education, professional hierarchy, what kind of profession are you seeing yourself in, a marital position, whether you're married or not married, and where are you married into, who do you marry, and parental rights, and economic benefaction. So the kind of benefaction you receive economically, what kind of inheritance do you get as being born in a certain family, and all these factors come together and create the culture and constructive elitism which continues to run after the colonial condition comes to an end. So when these forces interact unchecked, especially in a patriarchal culture, men become providence, the omnipotent, revered, feared, and incontrovertible shaper of human destiny, a god status that colonization assumed in its encounter with the native. So we find that the whole idea of godliness, the whole idea of supremacy, the sort of metaphysical supremacy which manifests itself into godliness, is something which the colonial control had historically sought to produce and perpetuate. Now, with the disappearance, with the completion of the colonial system, now the new people who take over are the important, powerful, authoritative men. And they begin to replicate the same godliness that colonialism had conferred historically, right? So that destiny, that shaper of destiny, whoever, that person, whatever he says, whatever he does, would shape other people's destiny. So that position of authority is conferred to them, and that obviously is reflective of a very flawed cultural condition, a very bipolar, a very imbalanced power position, a very imbalanced power hierarchy in a system like this, which puts certain people permanently in a marginalized position and certain people permanently at a privileged position. So the construct and ontology of privilege and marginalization are determined from birth, or at birth, shall we say, which is obviously a very, very unfortunate and tragic situation, and it just reflects a very flawed system of governance, etc. So this is an encounter that has left the latter, whose world is now permanently disrupted with enduring tension. So the latter here is the native. So what the essay is trying to say is, when the colonial encounter happened, when the colonial experience happened, the native was, controlled and coerced, not just physically and militarily or economically, but also a level of knowledge. The native was told again and again that the colonizer is supreme, the colonizer is superior, the colonizer is a greater person, a greater man, closer to God, etc. Right, and that process of brainwashing, the process of interpellation. That's the technical word, interpellation. Interpellation is a process through which you internalize certain ideologies, you internalize certain belief systems. And that interpellation, I mean, it was a term used by Louis Althusser, the Marxist critic philosopher. But that process was rampant during colonialism. And what we see over here is that process of internal interpellation continues even after colonialism, even during the post-colonial moment, with the only difference being that it's the men, the local tribal men, who now occupy positions of power. They become the new colonizers. And a woman, the less powerful men, they continue to occupy and inhabit the marginal positions. So, the enduring tension that is there is just a result of colonialism, but also is a confusing mixture of colonial attributes, colonial principles, as well as local principles, which both promote hierarchy of certain kinds, right? And that combination creates this permanent disruption, and that produces this enduring tensions, this ongoing tensions in the colonial space. Okay, so I stop at this point today. This, as I said at the beginning, this is the second last lecture on this particular novel, Nervous Conditions. We'll finish off this novel in the next session. Thank you for your attention.